I love this background behind me, even though it probably looks absolutely ridiculous from your perspective because like the camera's focusing on me, so it's like darker and then like the fire's brighter, so it probably looks ridiculous, but I really love it. Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be wrapping up the books that I read in November of 2022. Unfortunately, I only read 7 books this month, but I did get a few of some denser books off my physical TBR, which is good, and hopefully I can catch up in December. So let's just go through all the books that I did finish. So I started off with the later Middle Ages. 1272 to 1485 by George Holmes. This was a pretty dry read. I was interested in researching the medieval era, especially the later medieval era, and this one talked about both like the cultural stuff that was going on as well as some of the political, the kings that were in power, things like that. It also showed like shifting times from like 1200 to 1400 and how like within 200 years there was a lot of shift in society and culture and the ruling class and things like that. So I enjoyed it on an informative level, but I really struggled with just how dense a book it was to read. And like, it wasn't very entertaining to read. It was very dry history. So I struggled with it, but I feel like if you were really interested in the Middle Ages and you, don't mind dry histories, I think you'll really like this. I think I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read, because I wanted to get a bigger one off my list, but also one that wasn't like super dense, I read the White House Cookbook from 1899. This book, this copy I actually featured in the oldest books that I own copy because it is from 1899, but or like the early 1900s. I don't remember the specific copy, but the cookbook itself was originally published in 1899. I think my copy is from like 10 years later, but it's most of the book, it talks about different recipes, what you think a cookbook would have. But then the last section of the book I found really interesting because it talks about certain remedies for illnesses. It talks about menu planning that the White House would actually have. And interestingly enough, throughout the book, there are also these like massive pictures of different first ladies, which I thought was really cool. Here is an example of a few of the first ladies. Unfortunately, when it comes to like actually practically following these recipes, I don't think I personally could. With the oven, they didn't have like temperature on the oven, so it'd be like, put in the chicken into the oven at a very high heat. Well, what is that? 400 degrees? 450 degrees? I have no idea. They probably couldn't even have their ovens as hot as we do today. So my comparison would be all over the place. So I feel like practically using this to cook, it would not work. But I did really enjoy it from a non-practical standpoint as like a historical text, especially since like if I'm writing a book at the turn of the century in America, it'd be a really good example of what were like the fancier foods that would be served in fancier kitchens in America around the turn of the century. So I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it, but not super practical. All right, the next one I read was Going to the Sources, a guide to historical research and writing by Anthony Brundage. So this book I didn't find super helpful. I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars, and it's very much either one. It is outdated. I don't know how old this book is. 2002, so it's about 20 years old. So a lot of the ways of researching have changed and adapted with the modern access to the web that we have. So a lot of the advice that this book gives is either obvious, like anyone who's at least interested in history will be like, oh yeah, go to the library. Yeah, that makes sense. Or it is obsolete. It isn't important anymore. So I personally didn't find this book useful at all. But then I do have some experience as a historical researcher. I have a bachelor's in history. One chapter was kind of useful because it talks about what's primary source, what's secondary source, what types of primary sources are there and secondary sources, which for me wasn't useful because I know all these things already. But for someone who doesn't know it all, that might be somewhat useful. But for me, it wasn't useful at all. And yeah, I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. I wasn't a big fan. I didn't care for it. The next book I read is Valour by John Gwynne. This is the second book of the Faithful and the Fallen series. I'm currently reading the third one right now, but this one I ended up giving 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it. I will say the ending was a little bit underwhelming compared to like just how good the ending for the first book was. The first book had an amazing ending that just not only like wrapped certain things up, certain questions that you had in your mind, but it opens the floodgates to like everything else that was happening. And I will speak very vaguely because no spoilers. But it was a really interesting high fantasy following a cast and array of characters. Certain characters are more main in this book than in the first book. The main character, relatively main character, is still Corbin, who is this young son of just like this town. Is he the blacksmith? I don't think his father's the blacksmith, but this town farmer, this town guy that works in this medieval tiny town, and he's like thrust into these political warrings, and like giants are coming up, and there's this god war that is coming between Azeroth, this like ancient evil god, and Ilion, who is this like good god. And so you have this like great war, and then the prophecy that there is going to be a bright star that leads Elion's troops for good. And then you have I don't remember what the dark sun maybe, or the black sun or something like that, is going to lead Azeroth's troops. And so you have like humans and like this god and deep power that is in the background. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of like drama, and there was even like a little bit of romance in this one, which I enjoyed, because in the first one there wasn't really much romance, and I'm all here for the romance. So yeah, this is a great high fantasy series if you enjoy like medieval fantasy, a lot of action, a lot of interesting characters. It is a lot to follow, but it does a pretty good job, especially in this one compared to the first book, in reminding you who is this character. And same thing in the third book I'm currently reading. It does a good job saying, oh, this character was this person from a previous scene or a previous book. So I appreciated that. So yeah, really, really love this book. It's a great series. I'm enjoying it. All right, and then this one I'm prodigiously proud of. I finished Purgatory and Paradise. Okay, let me say, when I read last month, Hell, the first book of the Divine Comedy by Dante, I was like, oh, I literally even said in my monthly wrap up for last month that I was like, oh, this wasn't actually that bad. Here I thought that it would be like super dense and difficult to read, and I was like, no, this isn't bad at all. I actually enjoyed it. Like, it does have a lot of like ancient Greek and Roman as well as Renaissance references, but it's not horrible. These two are probably the main reason that I didn't read more books this month, because these two were a lot to read. And I honestly feel like I would have to read them at least 4 or 5 times to garner even like half of understanding of them. Like, there's so many like small things, small allegories and things like that. And there's so many references that we in the modern day and throughout history since Dante wrote this have seen religion and seen things like heaven and purgatory from the lens of Dante's. So it's interesting what an impact on even our modern society Dante has had. So the Purgatory obviously follows Dante as he travels through Purgatory with Virgil as his guide. And then Paradise, he travels with Beatrice, or Beatrice, I think is her Italian name. She guides him through heaven. So similar in Purgatorio, it is a mountain that they must ascend, obviously all the way up, and then you reach heaven when you get to the top. And then in Paradise, it is much more of like rings and going up. It was a lot, especially when I got to Paradise. Purgatory, like, it's interesting because each one of the books definitely advances in difficulty in reading. So Hell, I found it to be relatively easy to read. Purgatory was a challenge, but I was like, I can understand most of the stuff they're talking about. And then Paradise was like so way advanced. I was like, I'm not ready for this. So I do want to go back and read all these. Obviously, I ended up giving these both 5 out of 5 stars. They're incredible books, and just the detailed language is amazing. And I love this translation by Dorothy L. Sayers. It was just a beautiful translation to read. So it's a challenging series to read, but I'm glad I finally read it and got those off my physical TBR, because they're books not only that I've wanted to read for years, but they are dense books that I'm glad that I don't have to tackle next year when I'm going to have to be reading so many books a month. So now we get to the final book that I read in November, and that is The Stand-In by Lily Chu. So I ended up picking this up from my physical TBR simply because I needed a break. I needed to be able to turn off my brain and read kind of a mindless, cliched book after Dante's The Divine Comedy, because my brain was absolutely fried. So I picked up this. It's a light romantic comedy. It follows this girl, Grace, who's really struggling with her job. She has a horrible boss. She also has a mother who's in a care facility. Her mind's not completely there. And she gets photographed and thought to be this like famous actress, Feng Li, who is currently in Canada. This book takes place in Canada. And so Feng Li sees the picture and she contacts Grace and is like, can you pose to be me for public affairs? Because I am just like, I have this show that I am on a play, on like the Broadway version. And she's just so done with all this work, and she agrees to pay a large sum to Grace, and Grace is like, that money will allow me to put my mom in a better nursing home, a high quality, more expensive nursing home that she's been wanting to get her in for a long time, but she hasn't been able to afford it. So Grace agrees. There is also the love interest, who is Sam Yao, and he is like this Chinese actor, super hot. The book will remind you every 2 pages how hot he is, and that was the only thing that like super bothered me in this book. I was like, yes, I get it, he's attractive. You can move on. That's fine. And he is the co-star to Feng Li, and he is one of the few people who knows that Grace is going to be impersonating Feng Li. And so he hates her at first, so it's very much a hate to love type romance. And eventually they grow to care for each other. And I feel like it's obvious where this book goes, and so many things that are introduced early on, I was like, oh, this is where it's going to lead. And every prediction I had came true. So I won't say that it was a surprising book or like a deep book or the characters were really complex, but I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and it was a perfect fun read. It was exactly what I needed after Dante's The Divine Comedy, because after that one, I was just, my mind was absolutely fried. And this one was light and fun, and I really enjoyed how the book really spent time establishing a friendship between Grace and Sam, where it didn't go from like hate to love. It went from hate to you're okay, to I like you, to yeah, love. And I enjoyed that because it felt very real. You know, this takes place over, I think, 3 or 4 months. So obviously, you know, it's not like they know everything about each other, but they spend a lot of time talking, and a lot of the scenes that they have together were great. And I really felt their chemistry being strong. And one of the main themes in this book is that actors are real people too. That oftentimes we as fans don't necessarily see them as real people. We see them as the facade, the glamorous dresses and like the good looks. And we don't realize that behind that facade, they're real people. They struggle with depression. They struggle with their past or with difficult family members. They struggle with the exact same things that we do. They just happen to be wealthier and probably more good looking. So I enjoyed the themes in this book that were a little bit deeper, but it wasn't deep enough where it took me out of like the light, fun narrative. So it was a good book. I really enjoyed it. I ended up actually winning this as a Goodreads giveaway, and that was a few months ago, and I should have read it And I just never ended up reading it. So I'm glad I finally did now because I was such a big fan of it. So there are all the books that I read in November. I'm looking forward to hopefully reading more than 7 books in December, but we will see. What books did you read in November? Have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!